Language to talk about visual data. What is it? Language to talk about visual data is a specific type of language to make reference to nonverbal data. It uses specialized structures and vocabulary in order to analyze, summarize, present, and evaluate visual data.
Why you might use it? You might want to use a specific vocabulary and other language resources to talk about percentages, graphs, and other types of visual data in your research. Additionally, it could help you to convey your stance or perspective and the extent to which you believe the explanation to be correct.
Active and passive voice to talk about data. A good strategy would be to choose active or passive on the basis of old to new information flow. Specifically, passive constructions can be used to place the old or familiar information in the subject position and the new information that is the location of the data at the end. Some examples of passive voice to talk about data. The types of internet misbehavior common among university students are shown in Table 4. Summary statistics for the variables used in the analysis are provided in Table 5. Wealth as a function of age is plotted in Figure 1. A honeycomb solid oxide fuel cell unit with air cooling pad is shown in Figure 2.
Verbs in indicative and informative location statements. There are some verbs commonly used to refer to nonverbal material. Some of them can be used with both types of location statements. Show is one of those verbs. Indicative statements that summarizes what kind of research was done. For example, Table 4 shows the type of internet misbehavior common among university students. Or informative statements that highlights sometimes interesting about the data. For example, Table 4 shows that illegal downloading of music or films is common among students. Other verbs like show are describe, demonstrate, and point out.
Be careful with the use of that. The following sentences are examples of the use of that correctly. Table 5 shows that students engage in misbehavior on the internet using both private and public computers. Figure 1 reveals that wealth is accumulated slowly but sharply declines after age of 65. Notice the use of that in the two sample sentences. Sentences containing that clauses do not easily go into passive. For example, that wealth sharply declines after age of 65 is revealed in Figure 1. That sentence is wrong in the use of that. While the passive version follows the rules of grammar, the sentence that results seems awkward in comparison to the version in the active voice. Thus, if you want to highlight some aspect of the data using a that clause, use the active voice.
Comparisons. When you're talking about data, it is important for you to know how to make comparisons correctly. In comparison, it may not be a good strategy to make a series of statements like this example. 56% of girls report that their parents decide matters of faith, in contrast to 64% of boys. Instead, we use visual data language to make numbers and data clearer for the reader. For example, fewer girls than boys reported that their parents decide matters of faith. Or, more boys than girls reported that their parents decide matters of faith. Or, not as many boys reported that their parents decide matters of faith.
One problem here is the vagueness of language such as fewer or more. There is some language more accurate for these cases. For example, almost twice, nearly, or a smaller percentage. For example, Almost twice as many women as men reported that. Nearly 3 times as many men reported that. And a smaller percentage of women reported. And finally, nearly the same number of men and women exited.
Specific ways of moderating or qualifying a claim. Likelihood. There are many ways of expressing your degree of commitment to your claims in writing academic English. One simple way is to use modal auxiliary verbs like may, might, or could. For example, in the sentence, word of mouth advertising influences a consumer's incentive to purchase a product, you could say, word of mouth advertising can influence a consumer's incentive to purchase a product. Or, word of mouth advertising could influence a consumer's incentive to purchase a product, or with may or might, as you can see in the examples. Another way of moderating or qualifying claims is using phrases or verb phrases, as you can see in the following examples. In these examples, the phrases weakening strain.
Softening generalizations. Writers sometimes want to make generalizations. These can be effectively used either to start developing a point for which support is later provided, or drawing a conclusion from different pieces of information. Importantly, generalizations should be grounded in some reasonable evidence and stated cautiously so that they will be accepted by readers. 3 classic verbs for carefully steering a generalization are the verbs appear to, seem to, and tend to. For example, children living in poverty appear to do poorly in school. Children living in poverty seem to do poorly in school. And finally, children living in poverty tend to do poorly in school.
Another way to make a generalization more acceptable is to qualify or limit the subject. For example, many children living in poverty do poorly in school, or a majority of children living in poverty do poorly in school, or some children living in poverty do poorly in school. Finally, you could do it like, in most parts of the world, children living in poverty do poorly in school.
Weaker verbs. Claims can be reduced in strength by choosing a weaker verb. For example, many studies have concluded that excessive credit growth caused the global financial crisis. It has a stronger verb. But many studies have concluded that excessive credit growth contributed to the global financial crisis has a weaker verb. There are some weaker synonyms for common verbs. For example, state, and its weaker synonym is mention, show, suggest, validate, support, and clarify, depict.
Dealing with unexpected outcomes or problems. If your data is not quite what you expected, your first reaction might be to ignore the data that does not fit. Instead, you should try to find a way to discuss the data. In fact, such a discussion can help you position yourself as knowledgeable. If you're able to offer a brief explanation and perhaps suggest what work could be done in the future to overcome problems with your data. The verb phrases in these examples sentences may be helpful as you discuss imperfect data. For example, the difference between expected and obtained results may be due to fluctuations in the power supply. This discrepancy can be attributed to the small sample size. The anomaly in the observation can probably be accounted for by a defect in the camera. The lack of statistical significance is probably a consequence of weaknesses in the experimental design. Or the problem with dating this archaeological site would seem to stem from the limited amount of organic material available.